If you turn to Esther chapter 9, we come to our last message in the book of Esther. How many of you have heard of Chaim Weizmann? Anyone? He was a Russian-born Jew, 1874. He received his education in biochemistry. Is this drawing any? Now you guys remember? From Switzerland and Germany, where he became active in the Zionist movement. In 1905, he moved to England, and he attempted to land a position in London, but instead acquired a job, a chemistry professor in the University of Manchester, in the chemistry department. And he would later describe his position in Manchester as an almost random choice of provincial city. He describes his time in Manchester in the following way. You cannot imagine, next slide, you cannot imagine what it means for an intellectual to live in the English provinces and work with the local Jews. It's hellish torture. He considered them dull, ignorant crowd of dregs. So he didn't care for it, in other words, so much. Had things not improved fairly significantly, and soon he would have moved from Manchester. However, he soon found a group of friends, and in this next picture, there's some of his friends, and some of those friends married sisters of the other friends, and it became quite the intimate fellowship of friends, which caused him to stay in Manchester for over 30 years, I believe. During this time, who've heard of Winston Churchill? Okay, we've heard of Winston Churchill. One of the elements that was instrumental or necessary for the guns during World War I was acetone. Germany made it. So all of a sudden, when we're in war against Germany, we can't get our acetone, and we needed to find it some other way. Well, Weizmann produced it. He had come up with this manner of producing acetone, and he figured out how to produce it in the beer. Where do they make beer? Like breweries. They took the breweries and they re-established them for making acetone so that they could use them in the weapons in World War I for both America and England. So he became known to Winston Churchill that way. Also, he was introduced to two people during that time, one of them C.P. Scott and the other Arthur Balfour. Anyone know those guys? Yeah. They're just normal guys. They ended up being the Prime Minister of England and the head of defense, I believe, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary. He made friends with them because at a garden party he was introduced. Balfour would end up being the one that would push for England to acknowledge Israel as a nation and want them to have land in Palestine instead of Egypt. Another interesting little scenario comes. Two of Weizmann's friends are having dinner, and at this point, Harry S. Truman is the president of the United States, and Harry S. Truman is annoyed with everyone telling him what he should think about where Israel should have land if they have land and become a nation. He doesn't like being told what to do, and he just closes his office to everybody, including Weizmann. Two of Weizmann's friends are having dinner, and they remember they have a friend that is a close personal friend of Truman and a business partner. So they go from table to table and they gather change so that they can make this long distance call from the restaurant that they're at. And they call their friend and they plead with him, "Can you meet with Truman so that Weizmann can meet with Truman?" That night, he decides that he will do that. He goes to the White House unannounced, shows up and sits with Truman and pleads with him that he would just meet with Weizmann. Truman gets upset, turns around, gets up, walks away in the Oval Office. And his friend says, "You have your hero, and I have mine, and mine is Chaim Weizmann. Will you please meet with him?" And he does. And he changes Truman's opinion on whether Israel should have a nation and where they should be located if they do. And you see in the letter written by Truman on the next slide, Truman acknowledges, or maybe it is that slide, Truman acknowledges the country of Israel and that it should be located in Palestine. So let me ask you this. Are those events, a lunch with two friends, calling another friend, a garden introduction to Balfour, friend knowing Truman, him moving to Manchester and meeting those friends, are those coincidences? Do we just write that off to chance? I think as New Testament believers, we look at something like that and we see God, right? In our modern colloquialism, we may say it's a God thing, right? Well, that was a God moment, as if there were moments that weren't God moments, but needless to say, right? You see the hand of God in this acquaintance that he makes, or this meeting that he has, or this lunch that is had, and this letter that is written, and all of a sudden you see who Chaim Weizmann is the first president of Israel at the formation of Israel in the early 20th century, mid-20th century. We don't believe in coincidences. Did I mention God in the story of Weizmann at all? Did you see him? That's what Esther is. Esther is a story where God is never mentioned, yet he is always present. And I think what his intention, the author of Esther, is attempting to do is to force you to read the book that way and then force you to live your life that way, where God appears to be absent but is always present. To come to that conclusion, I want to track with me in this specific way in these three things. What I'd like to do is to look briefly at the final episode of Esther. We see the establishment of Purim in the second half of chapter 9, and we see the praise of Mordecai in chapter 10, which is 3 verses. We see then, so secondly, we see this I think there's this drastic contrast with the book of Daniel, and I want to point that out, and I think there's something that we can learn from that. And then I want to address the question, or the apparent absence of God in the book of Esther. That's our plan for this morning. So let's wrestle with this final episode. It's not very hard. In fact, I'm going to read it. You're going to see in it 2 things that are worth noting. One, chapter 9, the establishment of Purim. For what it's worth, the only Jewish holiday not ordained by God. I don't know what to do with that. It's also probably the most secular and the most carnal of all of their holidays. But that's the establishment of Purim is in the second half of chapter 9. I'll read that just a second. And then you see in chapter 10 an acknowledgement of the king, the praise of Mordecai, and the absence of Esther. So let me read those for you, and I'll pause a couple places. Starting in verse 20, chapter 9, Esther. And this really, I believe, it's as simple as they're establishing, we celebrate Purim. Why do we celebrate it? This is where it was established. This is the historical document that articulates why the Jews established or observed Purim. About Mordecai, and Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. And in essence, that's what Purim is. Even today, what they would primarily do is in Purim, they would read through the book of Esther. Whenever it comes to Haman, they would have noise makers, and they would shout and boo and hiss and make noise whenever Haman's mentioned. But the book cannot be read with any noise, so everyone has to stop entirely for the book to be continued to be read. But as soon as Haman is mentioned again, it's a cacophony of noise in the reading of Esther. And then they're commanded to get drunk if possible, like if they have a drinking issue, they're not supposed to, and if it's physically a problem, they're not supposed to. But they're supposed to get wasted to the point of not realizing the distinction between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordecai. And then they give gifts to each other. Oh, they have a dinner, and then they give gifts to each other. Those are the four elements of Purim. Fun holiday. So the Jews accepted, verse 23, so the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast pur, that is, cast lots, to crush and destroy them. So it's referencing the lots that Haman cast in his surrounding his decree to kill them all. Verse 25, but when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Verse 26, therefore they called these days Purim, after the term pur. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring, and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days, according to what was written and at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation and every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. Then a second letter is written by Esther and sent to confirm this. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail and Mordecai, the Jew, gave full written authority confirming the second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fast, their feast, and their lamenting. The command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. There is Purim, the establishment of Purim for 2 days, 14th and 15th of Adar, in which they read the book, drink, have a feast, and give gifts. Chapter 10, 3 verses. King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea. What an interesting statement. At first, when we think of the king taxed all these people, what is your natural inclination to think? Like, that's a negative thing. The other way of understanding this is that he actually imposed forced labor on the coastlands of the sea and the land. Likely, all this is doing is saying where his taxation was felt was everywhere that man was, on the land and on the sea. So it was actually talking about the breadth of Ahasuerus or Xerxes' rule, not that he was just a jerk and overtaxed everybody. So basically, at the end of the book, King Ahasuerus rules the land and the coastland of the sea. Basically, everywhere that people lived, Xerxes ruled. Verse 2. So Xerxes is done, verse 1. Mordecai. And all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers. For two reasons: he sought the welfare of his people, and he spoke peace to all his people. Good job, Mordecai, right? As I studied the end of the book, I was startled by the extreme contrast to Daniel. I'm going to draw your attention to that in just a second. But in essence, what we see with Mordecai at the end of the book, Esther isn't mentioned. Why? I don't know. Mordecai is mentioned in glowing account. And to be honest, I think we can all agree Mordecai is a national hero. He is a patriotic hero for Israel, is he not? But I would argue nothing would indicate that he is a spiritual hero. He's a patriotic hero, but not a faithful hero. And you may ask, why do you draw that conclusion? Why do you continue to berate all of the actors of Esther throughout this study? I'm not berating them. I think they're normal people. I do so because I think Daniel offers us another example that is so drastically different. And let me draw your attention to two specific places in Daniel. I'm sure you probably know the stories that I mentioned. One is in chapter 4, where I believe Nebuchadnezzar actually, I think, writes chapter 4. And he has this vision, and Daniel comes and he tells him the vision. And it's of this tree, and it's caring for all of these things, and yet it's cut down, and only a stump remains, and that stump then allegorically ends up being like a beast who's feeding off of the grass in the fields. And we know that Nebuchadnezzar went crazy. He had an amazing kingdom, amazing rule, and he was humbled by God as he looked over his kingdom and said, "Look what I have built." And God humbled him, and for 7 years he crawled around and ate the grass of the fields, probably in the palace area, hidden from all of the people. But what does God do for Nebuchadnezzar at the end of chapter 4? Let me draw your attention to Daniel 4, 34 to 37, and the text is on the screen. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And what did he do? I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Do you see a distinction between the end of Nebuchadnezzar's chapter and Esther? Let me draw your attention to another one in Daniel. Daniel chapter 6. Daniel prays. He's thrown into the lion's den. Darius goes and he grieves for Daniel. He doesn't want him to be lost. He cries out in anguish to Daniel, says, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions?" And Daniel cries out, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm." So what does Darius do, who would have been the co-leader with Cyrus, who is Xerxes' father. I think I got that backwards. One of them is Xerxes' father. This is a generation prior to Esther. So Xerxes, Ahasuerus, very well would have probably known them both. What is Darius' response to Daniel being spared in the lion's den? Peace be multiplied to you. And he makes a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and Cyrus. Do you see the difference? At the end of Darius, at the end of Nebuchadnezzar, you have, because of the faithful witness of a godly man in front of them, you have the kings of the world declare God is the best. Esther. How does it end? Mordecai is the best. God is nowhere. Esther's gone. The king is potentially just described in a fleeting pass. The king is in no way impacted by the greatness of God because of the lives of Esther and Mordecai. This is a stark contrast between Daniel and Esther. Third, so where is God in Daniel? Why isn't he there? I would argue he's everywhere. And I think the author was purposeful. In fact, I think he went to lengths at time to actually work at not mentioning him to force you to think about it. I think there are 4 ways, simple things, in which we see God, as we've walked through the book of Esther, we see in 4 ways God in the book of Esther. But before we get to that, remember where Esther is placed in the redemptive story of Scripture. Where's Esther line up historically? After Babylonian captivity, right? You're like, okay, I'm not sure the value of knowing that. Okay, well, describe God's presence with his people during and after the Babylonian captivity. Is he present with them? No. I mean, set aside his sovereignty and providence, his special presence is gone. Right? So, real quick, the garden, God walks with his people. He is present physically with his people. Because of sin, death comes, and separation from God comes, and man no longer has any interaction with God. And you go thousands of years before all of a sudden Abraham comes along, and God interacts in one person, right? And then you see him interact with others, Moses, and then to his people. And then his people build a tabernacle, and God comes down in a cloud and dwells with his people in the cloud in the tabernacle. The temple is built, and God comes down in a cloud and dwells with his people in the temple. One person, one day a year, can go behind the veil and interact with God for the people. But God is present with his people. But because of their disobedience, the 10 tribes are scattered out of Israel from the presence of God in Jerusalem. They go into Assyrian diaspora. The 2 southern tribes of Judah are taken by Babylon and taken into captivity and sent throughout the world as well, separate from the temple which is now destroyed. God is no longer present with his people there. We won't see that. In fact, they go into Babylonian captivity. They come back from the land. They build the temple. And what is it that the priests grieve when the temple is built, the cloud of God does not descend on the temple. God is not present with his people. That's when Esther's happening. Esther occurs in the midst of God being gone from his people. His presence has been removed from them. It's not till Christ comes in John 1:14 that the Word becomes flesh and dwells with us in the person of Jesus Christ. It's not till Revelation 21 when God walks with his people again. Esther's in the middle of this dark moment where God is absent, and the author brilliantly describes life when God appears to be gone. Yet we see him. We've been fashioned to see him everywhere. We've been taught about his sovereignty. We've been taught about his providence. So as New Testament believers, we look at a story like this and we say, yeah, he's not there, but he's everywhere in the book of Esther. And where do we see that? We see that sometimes in allusions. Mordecai mentions this. If you keep silent, he says to Esther, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. He doesn't say where, but there's this allusion to someone's going to deliver us. Haman even mentions this. His wife does. Like, you're in trouble because someone's going to deliver the Jews, and you're going to be beat. There's these allusions throughout the book where we see, I think they mean God. The author could have very easily just said, and God will deliver us, but he doesn't. Why? He's purposeful in that. Brilliantly so. We also see coincidences, right? It just happens that Vashti refuses to give in to Xerxes, and then Esther becomes queen. Is it just coincidence that Mordecai happens to be walking past two guys as they happen to be talking about the plot against the king? Is it just coincidence that Esther is received by Xerxes when she goes into him? Is it just coincidence that the king can't sleep and he happens to read the specific text in a specific book about Mordecai who has not yet been rewarded for his saving of the king? Is it just coincidence that Haman happens to be the guy standing in the corridor outside of Xerxes' room and gets called in to then honor Mordecai? Is it just coincidence that he makes gallows for Mordecai, the guy he ends up honoring that day instead of killing that day? Is it just coincidence that the king walks in on Haman as he throws himself at Esther near the end of the book? Are those coincidences? We don't think so. We see God in every one of those. What about reversals? Haman's hung on the gallows instead of Mordecai. The Jews, instead of being annihilated, are spared and defeat their enemies. Instead of Haman being second in command, Mordecai is second in command. Instead of Vashti being the queen, Esther's the queen. There's these reversals throughout the book, and in each of them we see the presence of God. We look at the theme in general, and we see the presence of God. We know that God made a promise to his people in Genesis 3:15 that someone would come through woman and save mankind. We know that in Genesis 15 and 17 and 20 that he promised that it would be through Abraham. He could not allow the people of Abraham to be destroyed without breaking his promise. And Esther is one of those moments in which he gloriously preserves his people so that he could keep his promise that he made thousands of years earlier. We see God everywhere. But do you in your life? See, if I tell you the story of Chaim Weizmann, you likely sit there and listen, and you're like, that's cool how God did that. We look at the story of Esther and we're like, wow, that is amazing how God navigated that. And yet we look at our own lives and we see what seems to be the absence of God, and we're like, are you there? Like in everyone else's story, we see God everywhere except our own. And we struggle, we grieve the absence of God. We plead with Him, show me your presence. Help me to know that you are near and present in my life. I feel like you are distant. I wonder if you care. Do you realize the things I'm enduring? What the author wants us to do is to apply what he forces us to do in his book. He wants us to apply that to our lives. He forces us. He could easily have just said, God will save us. He could have easily said they fasted and prayed to God. He could have said that God delivered them. He could have inserted a total of 5 words in the entire book, and it screamed God. He went out of his way to avoid using God and any deliberate religious terms. He had to work at that. Why? Because that's how it appeared to be. It appeared that God was gone. He forces you. I think he does a marvelous job as he forces you to look at the story and say, God's there, and God is there, and God is there. My hope is that you realize that for you. Do you ever accept that your pain is God's providence in your life to mold you into the character he wants of you? Do you ever look back in your life and you had a dinner with someone and that relationship transformed things and redirected you? Some of you live with physical pain daily. Do you see God's providence? I do. It's easy for me to look at you and say, I see God crafting you and molding you and desiring to conform you into the image of his glorious and beautiful Son. And he does that through heartache. Count it all joy when you encounter trials of various kinds, for you know that the perfecting of your faith comes as a result of this. So do you see God's providence in your brokenness? Do you see God's providence in your blessings? Not his punishment, his gracious providence. He is aware of you. He cares for you. Every single moment, he's in control. Are you good at seeing that in everyone else, but not your own life? Even while appearing absent in your life, God is present and active everywhere, working all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. God's name is never mentioned once in this story. But those who decide to ignore this book for that reason miss out on an incredible truth God left for us to uncover. Esther is a book for every struggling Christian who can't seem to see God through the fog of life. It's a book for every discouraged Christian who is weighed down by persecution in a world that is opposed to the gospel. Take more effort, at least as much effort, to see God in your own life as we have seen in the book of Esther. Lord, we We are in a different position. We live after the coming of Christ. We have the indwelling of the Spirit. I mean, it's a different scenario for us than it was for Esther. I mean, we have hope. She was looking forward to this hope, a coming Messiah, or she or her people were at least. We look back, we know we have it, we possess it, and yet we still. So imagine what she was like. We still live, because it's been 2,000 years since Christ has been here, and the Holy Spirit sometimes seems ethereal. It seems distant. I mean, we know mentally and theologically that he indwells our heart and he convicts, but it seems intangible. So we can feel like Esther, and we feel that you are gone. We experience life and we wonder if you care. Our world is a mess. It's a mess. And we're like, do you see what's going on? Do you care about what's going on? Are you in charge of what's going on? Do you actually lift up and lower kings and presidents and dictators? Are you actually in charge? Are you here? You are. Most gloriously, through the work of Christ, experientially, presently, in the work of the Spirit. And yet our hearts long for the moment when we walk with God, you walk with your people in their midst. Until then, we will aspire, we will strive, we will long for and look for your presence in every moment of life. In the midst of heartache, in the midst of blessing, despair and happiness, pain and health, loss, relational, whatever it may be. We will trust in your goodness. Conform us to the image of your Son. In Jesus' name, amen.